Kitty. We have the Bungalow Mystery, and we are on Chapter 14, A Desperate Situation. The warning came too late. Before Nancy could turn, the end of the cane crashed down upon her head. With a low moan of pain, she sagged to the floor and lay still. How long she remained unconscious, the young sleuth did not know. When at last she opened her eyes, Nancy found herself stretched out on the cold floor of the cellar. Bewildered, it was a full minute before she could account for the splitting pain in her head. Then, with a shudder, the young sleuth remembered what had happened. She had been struck down from behind. Who was her assailant? Nancy became aware that someone was standing over her, but objects whirled before her eyes, and she could not distinguish the face. Then, gradually, her vision cleared. She saw Stumpy Dowd gazing upon her, a satisfied leer upon his face. "Well, Miss Drew," he said mockingly, "we meet again. You've gotten in my way once too often." As Nancy started to speak, Dowd reached down. Catching Nancy by the arm, he jerked her roughly to her feet. Nancy was so weak she nearly fell over. Nevertheless, with a show of spirit, she said, "You'll regret this, I promise you." "Let the girl go," Jacob Aborn pleaded from the other side of the room. "Do anything you like to me, but set her free." Nancy saw he was again padlocked. Stumpy Dowd glared at his other prisoner. "It's quite impossible for me to release either of you," he said calmly. "You see, you both know too much." Nancy was aware that resistance would be useless. Right now, she did not have the strength to make a break for the stairs. But the criminal began to unwind a long rope. Nancy realized that unless she thought of something, the situation would be desperate. There would be no way to escape. As Stumpy began to bind Nancy's feet together, he said sarcastically, "Mr. Aborn will enjoy having company, and you two will have so much to talk about." An idea suddenly came to Nancy. She remembered that a detective who had called on her father a few months ago had told her how it was possible to hold one's hands while being bound so as to slip the bonds later. He had given a demonstration. "If only I can remember the correct position," Nancy prayed fervently. When Dowd began to bind Nancy's wrists, she tried to follow the detective's instructions. As the ropes cut into her flesh, it seemed to Nancy that she must have made a mistake. Certainly there was little space between her wrists and the bonds. "And now, just to make sure you won't get away," Stumpy muttered with a sneer. He took the end of the rope and ran it through a ring on the wall, knotting the rope fast. "I guess that will hold you for a while and teach you not to meddle in affairs that are none of your business," the man added. Nancy Drew had never been so angry in her life, but she realized that any argument she might give would only provoke the man to further torture. So she set her jaw grimly and kept still. "You'll pay for this, Dowd," Jacob Aborn spoke up in a quavering voice. "When I get free—" "When you get free," Stumpy Dowd taunted. "That's a laugh. Why, you fool, how do you propose to get help? If it hadn't been for this meddlesome Drew girl, only the rats would have known you were here." Nancy could not help but remark quietly, "The police will catch you in the end." "I doubt it," Dowd said with confidence. "I've covered my trail thoroughly. I made plans to leave the country, and I'd like to see the police or anyone else catch me." He turned to Laura's guardian. "First, of course, we'll have to get the jewels away from Laura." "How do you propose to do that?" Nancy asked quickly, "when you don't know where she is?" Stumpy Dowd laughed. "That's what you think. Laura is at your home in River Heights, Nancy Drew." As Nancy blinked, a look of horror came into Mr. Aborn's eyes. Nancy Drew knew he was wondering why she had not mentioned Laura's being at her home. Also, he realized that his last hope of keeping Laura's whereabouts unknown was gone. Nancy, too, was worried. What did Stumpy plan to do? Right now he looked pleased at his prisoner's reactions. "My wife overheard Laura placing a call to Nancy Drew in River Heights yesterday morning. When Laura ran away, we had a hunch she would go there. I asked my detective to find out. Dowd said that the sleuth had seen Laura leaving the house that afternoon with a young man. I presume she left her jewels behind, he added, but we'll get them before we leave this area. Don't try anything foolish, Nancy warned. All my plans are well made, Dowd said coolly. Too bad you aren't more cautious, Miss Drew. He said that his wife had felt a draft in the house and gone downstairs to find the front door partway open. Then she had seen a girl heading into the woods and had awakened him. Dowd had figured out it might be Nancy. That's the end of my story, he said, except to tell you, Aborn, that I sold your blue sedan this morning. The money helped pay for my new foreign car. Jacob Aborn was so furious he almost choked. You robber! You kidnapper! He cried out. Tut, tut, none of that, Dowd said. You'll get your blood pressure up. Laura's not in your clutches, and she won't get there, Aborn stormed, and I can support her without any inheritance. Dowd shrugged. It won't do you any good to threaten me. You're my prisoner, and don't forget it. After the jewels are mine. Nancy felt as if she would choke with rage. Mr. Aborn closed his eyes and seemed to have fainted. Meanwhile, Stumpy Dowd had replaced the key on the wall. The hook supporting it, Nancy saw, was far out of the two prisoners' reach. You can think about this in the days ahead, the crook taunted. And now, goodbye. Turning, he ambled up the steps. Nancy heard mocking laughter as the trap door was slammed shut. Soon, a death-like quiet fell upon the shack. Mr. Aborn, Nancy called. There was no answer. Nancy's heart beat wildly. Was the man only in a faint, or had something worse happened to him? Holding her breath, she strained her ears to see if she could detect any signs of life. A few seconds later, Nancy caught faint sounds of inhaling and exhaling. Thank goodness, she thought. Presently, the man stirred, and, regaining consciousness, looked about. Seeing Nancy, he exclaimed, Now I remember! We were so near freedom! Yes, we were, Mr. Aborn, and we may get out of here yet. I'm trying to slip this rope off my wrists. In the meantime, I want to tell you why I didn't mention that Laura was at my home. I was about to do so when you urged that we should leave the shack as soon as possible. I see, and I forgive you, said Mr. Aborn. Never having met you, Dowd's announcement gave me a momentary feeling of distrust in you, but that's gone now. Then would you mind telling me about Laura's mother and the estate she left? Nancy requested as she worked to free her hands. I'll be glad to. Mrs. Pendleton appointed the Monroe National Bank executor of her estate and me as Laura's guardian. During Mrs. Pendleton's long illness, she had all her securities taken from her private safe deposit box and put in care of the bank. They were turned over to the custodian department and kept in the bank's personal vault. Then how could Stumpy Dowd get them? Nancy asked. That's the mystery. He didn't say. Nancy was convinced now that a good portion of Laura's inheritance must be among the securities stolen from the bank. She asked whether Mrs. Pendleton had left a large estate. Mr. Aborn nodded. Laura is a very wealthy young woman, he said, and went on to explain that at the time of Mrs. Pendleton's death, the Aborns were abroad. Upon their arrival in New York, Mrs. Aborn had received word of her mother's illness. It was then that Laura had been asked to postpone coming to Melrose Lake until his wife's return. Laura was staying at her boarding school with the headmistress until our trip to Melrose. She never received your letter, Nancy told him. The Dowds must have intercepted it. Soon they told her to come. Just then, Nancy thought she had found the trick to freeing her hands, but a moment later she sighed in discouragement. The rope still bound her wrists. At least we have a light, she said. Fortunately, Stumpy Dowd had forgotten the lantern. Yes, but the oil is burning low, Mr. Aborn remarked quietly. When it's gone, we'll be in the dark, as I have been for the past 2 weeks. Nancy shuddered. Did Stumpy bring you food in little packages? Yes, when he thought of it. He kept me alive just to pump me for information, and threatened to harm Laura if I didn't tell him what he wanted to know. Suddenly, Nancy felt the rope which chained her wrists slacken. At the same time, the light went out. The cellar was plunged into darkness.